72 hours. That was the figure the clerk had written on the paper, in a hand too neat for the violence it carried, and it was the figure that hung now in the cold air of the estate office like a struck bell still ringing. 72 hours, counted from the moment the claim was filed, and 11 of them had already bled away into the gray afternoon before anyone thought to send for her. She arrived at Eldermere with chalk dust still under her fingernails from another man's ledgers, her boots soaked through from the lane, which the recent rains had turned to a brown, sucking porridge. She had not expected to be summoned back. A year had passed since she had last stood in that hall, breathing the smell of drying paper and beeswax, and in that year she had allowed herself to think of the place only rarely, and only with a kind of careful fondness, the way one thinks of a wound that has closed well. It had not closed well. It had merely closed. The butler met her at the door with an expression she had learned, in her previous visit, to read as alarm dressed in composure. He did not waste words on greeting. "The Marquis will see you directly," he said. "There is not a great deal of time." She followed him past the library she had rebuilt board by board, spine by spine, through a winter of blistered fingers and borrowed candles, and she noted, with the automatic attention of her trade, that the shelves were dry now, the leather sound, the gilt unspotted. It was, she thought, the one part of this house that had not fallen apart in her absence. The Marquis stood at the window of his study with his back to the door, and when he turned, she saw 11 months written plainly on him, in the set of his jaw, in the shadow beneath his eyes, in a stillness that was not calm, but merely exhaustion wearing calm's clothing. "You came quickly," he said. "I was told there was urgency, my lord." "There is." He did not soften it. "By Thursday noon, this house and everything in it belongs to my cousin, unless a piece of paper is found that no one living has seen in 18 months. She did not ask which paper. She had already begun, without meaning to think backward, through months, through candlelight, through her own hands moving a needle through cracked old leather, feeling, beneath her fingers, a thickness in the spine of a book she had assumed was only glue. "The family Bible," she said. Something crossed his face. Not hope, not yet, but the ghost of a question he had not dared ask aloud. "What do you know of it?" Outside, the rain had begun again, tapping the glass like a clock, counting what remained. She told him only what she was certain of, for certainty was the one currency she had brought with her. A thickness at the spine, she said, that she had noted and dismissed. Old glue, she had thought at the time. The residue of a previous binder's carelessness, the kind of flaw one smooths over rather than questions, because a bookbinder's business is repair, not archaeology. She had not opened the boards further. She had not held it to the light, and turned it as one might turn a suspicious coin. "You did not think to mention it," he said. It was not quite an accusation. It had the shape of one, the way a closed door has the shape of a room behind it. "There was nothing then to mention, my lord. A book is full of small oddities, when it has survived a flood and 40 years of handling before that." He looked at her a moment longer than courtesy required, and she understood he was deciding whether to believe her, and beneath that, whether belief was even the thing he needed just now, with 2 days standing between the house and its loss. "The solicitor says the true will burned with the water damage," he said. "He has said it since the week my father died. He has said it to the court, to my cousin's men, to me. So many times I have begun to hear it in my sleep." "And do you believe him?" The question surprised them both, coming from her mouth in that room, addressed to a man 11 months a marquis, and not yet accustomed to being questioned by anyone below a peer. But he did not rebuke her for it. "I believe he believes it," he said slowly. "My father trusted no one in his last months. Not the solicitor, not—" He stopped himself, and the unfinished sentence hung there, heavier for being incomplete. "He asked for the Bible 3 days before he died. I did not think of it again until yesterday." She felt something settle in her chest, cold and exact, the way a measurement settles once taken. "I would need to see it again, my lord, and undo what I sowed." "You mean to unpick your own work?" "I mean to unmake it, if I must, to learn what it hides." He turned back toward the window, and she watched the rain move down the glass in long, unhurried lines, indifferent to the hours the house had left. "Thursday noon," he said again, as though repetition might slow it. 61 hours, if my clerk's arithmetic can be trusted. "Then I had better begin tonight, my lord," she said, "for candlelight is slower than daylight, and thread does not care for deadlines." The library had not changed in a year, though she noticed how quickly the eye forgets what the hand once repaired. The shelves stood true. The new plaster held no trace of the flood that had once ruined them, 18 months gone now, the waterline she'd scrubbed from memory alone. She was led to the case where the Bible waited, its green Morocco cover dulled by handling, the gilt lettering she had touched up herself, already softening at the edges from use, or from grief, she could not tell which. The butler brought a second candle without being asked. He set it at her elbow and said nothing, though she caught him studying her hands as she opened her workbox. The awl, the bone folder worn smooth at its curve, the small hooked blade she used for lifting old thread without tearing the leather beneath it. He had watched her work a year before. He watched her now the way a man watches weather he has already guessed the shape of. 60 hours, the Marquis said from the doorway, not stepping in. "I heard the clock in the hall, my lord. It keeps time enough for both of us." She did not look up from the spine. The end band she had sewn herself sat neat and tight beneath her fingers, the very stitches she had drawn through in April with a steadiness she remembered feeling proud of. Pride felt foolish now. She pressed her thumb along the ridge above the cords, and felt again what she had felt then, the thickness that should not have been there, the give beneath the leather that she had blamed, at the time, on old glue gone brittle with age. She had not questioned it further. There had been no reason to. A bookbinder learns to leave well enough alone once a book is sound. Tonight there was reason enough for anyone. She threaded the hooked blade beneath the first stitch and paused, feeling the small violence of the act settle into her wrist before she had even begun. To unmake careful work was a different labor than to make it. Slower, more exacting, each thread drawn free, a small admission that nothing sewn shut stays shut forever, not if someone wants badly enough to know what is inside. "You are certain," the Marquis said, still from the doorway, "that this is not merely old glue?" "I was certain of that once, my lord. I am no longer permitted the comfort of it." He did not answer. She heard him move nearer, though not near enough to see over her shoulder. A courtesy, she understood, though whether it was hers or his own uncertainty, she could not say. The candle guttered once in a draught from the hall and steadied. Somewhere beyond the windows the rain had thinned to a patient drizzle, indifferent as ever to the 59 hours now left, and to the first thread, drawn free, curling loose in her fingers, like something finally permitted to breathe. She set the thread upon the blotting paper beside her, a thin curl of waxed linen no thicker than an eyelash, and did not look at it again. To look too long at what had already been undone was to invite doubt, and doubt was a luxury the hour did not permit her. The second stitch resisted more than the first. She had sewn this end band with care a year before, in the flush of new commission and the particular pride of restoring what had nearly been lost to water and neglect. She remembered the satisfaction of it, the neat, even tension of thread against board, the way the spine had closed under her hand, like something healing. Now each pull unmade that satisfaction, thread by thread, and she found she could not decide whether the ache in her fingers was labor or grief. 58 hours, said the Marquis, not as a question. 58, she agreed, not looking up. The butler entered without ceremony, bearing a small tray, tea gone lukewarm before it had even left the kitchen, she suspected, given the hour, and the household's evident disorder. He set it near her elbow without a word, glanced once at her hands, and did not leave immediately. She felt his attention settle on her the way a physician's might, quiet and assessing, though she could not have said what he saw beyond a woman bent low over a ruined binding. "You have not eaten since noon," he said at last, to the room in general, though his eyes had not left her. "I am not hungry." "No," he said. "I imagine you are not." He withdrew then, and she understood, in the particular way one understands things too tired to examine them closely, that he had not spoken for her comfort, but as a small warning to the man still standing in the doorway. a warning the Marquess seemed not to hear, or chose not to. The third and fourth stitches came away more easily, as though the binding itself had wearied of holding its secret. Beneath the false end band, the true sewing structure began to reveal itself. Older, coarser thread, the color gone from cream to the deep amber of long confinement, and beneath that, unmistakably, a firmness that was not glue, not board, not anything a bookbinder's hand would have placed there by design. She stopped. "My lord," she said, and heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt. "I believe I have found the place." He crossed the room fully now, close enough that she caught the faint smell of rain still clinging to his coat, and looked down at the spine where her hands had gone still above it, not from fear, though fear was certainly present, but from the sudden, terrible awareness that whatever lay beneath that thread had been placed there deliberately, by a man who had trusted no one else alive to find it. 57 hours remained. Neither of them moved to look away from the candle's small, steady light. The candle guttered once, and the Marquess did not reach to steady it. He seemed, she thought, a man deliberately holding his hands away from temptation, as though the smallest interference might collapse whatever fragile architecture had brought them to this moment. 57 hours. She had begun repeating the number to herself, as one repeats a psalm whose comfort lies only in its familiarity, not its meaning. "Do not stop on my account," he said, and there was something almost gentle beneath the flatness of it, though gentleness did not come naturally to him, and she suspected it cost him something to offer it. She did not stop. She could not. Now, the discovery had its own momentum, the way a dropped stitch in a garment will run of its own accord once loosened, faster than the hand that loosened it. Her needle found the fifth stitch, then the sixth, and with each one, the false end band peeled further back, revealing beneath it a seam of paper, not board, not padding, but paper folded thin and pressed flat, protected by something oiled that caught the candlelight in a dull, private sheen. She had felt this same firmness a year ago and called it glue. The memory returned to her whole, unbidden, the flood-swollen room, the smell of standing water and mildewed calf leather, the old Marquess's Bible, pulled from a ruined shelf and laid across her work table, like something rescued from drowning. She had run her thumb along the spine then, noted the odd thickness, and thought nothing more of it, a bookbinder's habit, to notice such things, and set them aside as curiosities of an older, cruder craft. She had not imagined a dying man's hands doing the placing. "You knew," the Marquess said quietly, not quite a question, "that something was here." "I knew there was something," she answered. "I did not know it was this." He said nothing further, but she felt his stillness change register, the way a room changes when someone standing in it has stopped breathing without meaning to. She kept her eyes on the thread, not his face, because looking at his face just then would have cost her the steadiness her hands required, and steadiness was the only thing she had left to give him. The seventh stitch came free. Beneath it, the oiled paper shifted, not fully loosed, not yet readable, but enough that its edge lifted a fraction from the spine, enough that she could see, faintly, the ghost of ink beneath the wrapping, old and brown and deliberate. She set down her needle. "My lord," she said again, and this time her voice did not hold so well, "I think we ought to send for the solicitor before I go further." He looked at her, as though she had suggested extinguishing the candle entirely, and somewhere beyond the library door, the house clock began, faintly, to strike the hour. The clock struck once, then again, and she counted without meaning to, an old habit, learned from a father who had timed the setting of glue by the church bell and never trusted a watch that could be wound wrong. 10, 11. She stopped herself at the third stroke, and made herself look instead at the paper's lifted edge, at the brown ghost of ink she dared not yet call a will. "The solicitor," the Marquess repeated, as though testing the shape of the word in his mouth and finding it foreign. "At this hour." "At this hour," she agreed, "because if I go further alone, my lord, and it is torn, or the ink runs, or I am simply wrong about what I am looking at, there will be no one to say I did not tamper with it. There will only be your word, and mine, and a claimant who would be glad of either failing." She did not say his mother's name. She did not need to. It sat in the room with them, unspoken, the way the smell of the extinguished snuff of the candle sat in the room, faint and acrid and impossible to unknow once noticed. He was quiet long enough that she began to fear he would refuse her, that pride or grief or some private calculation would win out over caution, and then he rose, and went to the bell pull by the door, and rang it once, briskly, the way a man rings for a servant, when he does not trust his own voice to carry a request further than that single motion allows. The butler came within the minute, as though he had been standing near enough to hear the strike of the clock himself, and had counted, as she had, without meaning to. He took in the scene, the Bible open on the table like a wound, the candle burned low, the two of them not touching but standing closer than either had likely intended, and he asked no question at all. He only said, "I will send the boy for the solicitor directly, my lord," and was gone again before the Marquis had finished nodding. 71 hours, the Marquis said, once the door had shut. It was the first time either of them had said the number aloud since morning, and it landed strangely in the hush of the library, less like arithmetic than like a sentence being read out in a courtroom. Neither of them had yet entered. 70, she corrected quietly, glancing at the clock. The hour has already struck. He looked at her then, not at the Bible, not at the paper, but at her, with an expression she could not quite name, though it put her in mind of a man recalculating the weight of something he had believed. Until that moment, he understood entirely. She did not ask what he meant to recalculate. She had learned, over the 11 months since he had taken the title, and the 18 months since the flood had ruined his father's shelves, that the Marquis said very little of what he was thinking, and that the little he said was worth attending to for what it left out. So she returned to the Bible instead, tilting the candle so its light fell along the spine rather than across it, and resumed the work her hands had not, in truth, ever stopped wanting to do. The old stitching came away in short, reluctant lengths. She had sewn it herself a year before, in the calm of a summer that now seemed to belong to someone else's life, and she found she resented her own competence, the neatness of the knots, the discipline of the tension, all of it conspiring now to slow her. A lesser hand would have made this easier. She said nothing of this. She only worked. "You knew," he said, after a while, not as an accusation. "When you rebound it, you knew there was something in the spine." "I knew there was a thickness," she said. "I told myself it was old glue, board paper perhaps, gone stiff with damp." She drew the needle free and set it in the pincushion at her wrist. "I did not let myself think further than that." "Why not?" She considered the question longer than its size seemed to warrant. "Because a bookbinder who begins imagining what her clients have hidden in their bindings," she said, "very quickly stops being trusted with bindings at all." He was quiet at that, and she felt, rather than saw, something shift in him, not doubt, but a kind of respect turning over slowly, like a man testing ice before he trusts his full weight to it. The clock in the hall struck the half-hour, thin and certain, and both of them counted it without meaning to, the way they had counted the hour before. 70 hours, she said again, softer this time, more to herself than to him, marking the number the way she might mark a stitch count in a ledger, not with dread exactly, but with the ordinary, exhausting arithmetic of work still owed. He moved to the window, though there was nothing beyond it but the dark and the shape of the drive where the boy would soon be riding for the solicitor. "My father chose you," he said, "to bind this, not the London men, you." "He chose the cheaper hand," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, only fact. "No," he said, turning back. "He chose the steadier one." And then, before she could answer, he came to stand beside her again at the table, watching her hands resume their work on the spine, on the last threads that stood between the household, and whatever truth the old man had sewn into it. She did not look up at the steadier one remark, though it settled somewhere beneath the collarbone and stayed there, the way a compliment does when there is no time to receive it properly. Her needle found the next thread, and the next, and she counted those too, silently, the way she had counted the clock. 1, 2, the old waxed linen resisting, then giving. The candle had burned down to a stub since supper, and no one had thought to replace it. She noticed this the way she noticed everything now, peripherally, a fact filed for later use. The light would not last the hour. She said so, plainly, and he went himself to the sideboard for a fresh taper, rather than ringing for the footman, which struck her as a small, telling thing, though she did not remark on it. 69 hours, she said, when the new candle had caught and steadied. You keep better time than the clock. The clock doesn't have to answer for it. He almost smiled. She saw it begin at the corner of his mouth and then abandon itself, as though he had remembered, mid-motion, what the hours actually contained. She bent back to the spine. The old glue had dried unevenly, thicker near the tail than she recalled, and she paused, turning the book slightly toward the light, running her thumb along the ridge of it. "What is it?" he said, not a question so much as a demand dressed as one. "Nothing yet. A thickness. I noted it before, a year ago, and thought it was carelessness on my own part, or the damp working into the old boards." She did not say more than that, because there was nothing more to say until the threads gave up their secret, and she had learned, long before this house had ever needed her, not to promise what her hands had not yet delivered. He did not press her. He only stood, watching the small, deliberate motions of her fingers, and she was aware of him standing there in a way she had not been aware of anyone in a great while. Not admiration exactly, not yet, but a kind of attention that made the room feel smaller and the hour feel longer. The hall clock ticked on, indifferent to either of them. Somewhere above them, a door closed, footsteps crossed a landing, and the household settled into whatever uneasy sleep it could manage, with a solicitor's letter still unanswered, and a cousin's claim sitting like a stone in the front hall. Down here, in the library that still smelled faintly of last year's flood beneath the new leather and beeswax, the only sound was the give of thread, the scratch of the blade freeing it, and the low, steady breathing of two people counting the same hours toward two very different ends. 61 hours remained, though no one in the room had said so aloud. She had begun to measure the night that way instead of by the clock's face, not in minutes but in the small units of her work, each one a fraction subtracted from a sum that would not wait for her patience. 6 stitches unpicked, then 11, then a knot that resisted the blade and cost her nearly a quarter hour of held breath and careful pressure before it surrendered. She did not look up when he finally spoke again. "Your father taught you this." It was not quite a question. She answered it as though it were. "He taught me to listen to the spine before I touched it. A book will tell you where it wants to be opened, if you let it. And this one? This one does not want to be opened at all." She drew the blade along another thread, slow, and the leather sighed faintly under her hand, the old flood smell rising again from beneath the new binding like breath from a closed mouth. "Which tells me something was placed here that wished very much to stay hidden." He said nothing to that, but she felt the stillness in him sharpen, the way a man's attention sharpens when a thing he has suspected is at last given shape by another person's voice. She did not look at him to confirm it. She had learned, in a year of correspondence about damaged pages and remargined maps, that he revealed more when unwatched than when observed, and she extended him now the same discretion she had once extended a nervous horse her father kept for deliveries, patience, and the appearance of indifference, so that the true response might come unguarded. The old clock in the hall struck the half-hour. Neither of them moved to acknowledge it, though she felt the sound pass through her like a small cold current. Another marker set down against the 60 remaining, then 59, then whatever number the coming hours would insist upon, regardless of what either of them wished. Behind her, near the door, she was aware of the butler's soft tread pausing rather than passing, a small hesitation she had come to recognize over the long evening as his particular language, since he was not a man given to open remark. He set something down on the sideboard behind her without a word, a cup, she thought, from the faint chime of china against wood, though she did not turn to see if it was meant for her or for the Marquis, or whether it mattered which. She bent again to the spine, feeling beneath her fingers the place where the false end band gave way at last to something firmer beneath. Not glue, not board, but paper, folded close and long undisturbed, waiting exactly where a dying man's hands had once pressed it into hiding. She did not call out. She had learned, over these 2 days, that the moment for calling out had passed somewhere around the first hour, when astonishment might still have been permitted her. Now there was only the work, and the work required silence, the way a held breath requires stillness. Any sound might loosen something in her that needed, for a little while longer, to stay fastened. The paper resisted her at first, swollen faintly with old damp, the ghost of the flood still living in its fibers, though the flood itself was 18 months gone. She did not pull. She had ruined enough bindings in her apprenticeship, in her father's cold workshop with his voice behind her saying, "Patience is not slowness, it is exactness, held longer." To know what pulling cost, she worked her smallest blade beneath the fold instead, a breath's width at a time, feeling the paper's resistance the way she might feel a pulse. The Marquis had gone very still beside her. She did not look up to confirm it, she felt it, the particular quality of a man holding himself in check, the same stillness she had noticed in him a year ago, standing amid the ruin of his library, watching water find its way into 3 centuries of his family's paper, and refusing to let his face show what it cost him to watch. "How much longer?" he said, and it was not truly a question, more a thing he needed to say aloud, so that the clock's half-hour might have some answer set against it. "I cannot tell you that, and be honest," she said. "I can tell you it is close." The oiled paper resisted the blade for the length of 3 heartbeats, then gave. She set the blade down. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were not entirely steady, a fact she filed away to be ashamed of later, when there was time for shame, when there was time for anything beyond this narrow candlelit table and this narrow candlelit hour. With 2 fingers, she drew the folded paper free of the spine's hollow, feeling the binding sigh open around it as though it had been waiting a year to be relieved of its secret. She did not unfold it. That much restraint she had left in her. It was not hers to open, not yet, not before the man beside her, whose father's hand had folded it, whose father's dying distrust had chosen this hiding place over every other in the house. She set it on the table between them, on the worn green baize, beside the ruined end band and the small pile of thread she had drawn from the binding stitch by stitch through the long night. The clock in the hall, patient and indifferent, said nothing further. But somewhere behind her, the butler's soft tread resumed at last, moving toward the door rather than away from it, as though even he understood that whatever came next was not a thing meant to be witnessed standing still. The Marquis did not reach for it at once. His hand hovered above the paper, fingers spread as a man's might over a fire he was not certain would burn him, and in that hesitation, she saw more than she had seen in 11 months of careful courtesy between them. She saw a boy, waiting to learn what his father had truly thought of him, in the last clear hour before illness took the last of his clarity. The clock in the hall read 2:15. 51 hours remained before the court's patience expired, though neither of them spoke the number aloud. It sat between them the way the paper did, present and unavoidable, and, for the moment, untouched. "You may open it," she said. "I know." He did not. Instead, he turned to her, and for the first time that night she saw the whole of his face by candlelight rather than its edges, the shadow beneath his eyes, the small muscle working at his jaw, the particular stillness of a man holding himself together by habit rather than ease. "You unpicked a year's work in a night," he said. 2 nights. You should be asleep. So should you. It was not defiance, only fact, offered the way she might have noted the weather, and something in him seemed to loosen at the plainness of it, as though he had expected accusation, and received instead only tiredness matching his own. He picked up the paper then, not to open it, merely to hold it, testing its weight as a man tests a coin for counterfeit, though there was no doubting this. The oiled paper had done its work. Not a corner had softened, not a fold had given way to a year of damp and silence within the spine. "He trusted no one in this house," the Marquis said quietly. "Not my mother, not the solicitor, not even the walls. In the end, he wanted it sewn into something that would have to be destroyed to be found. He trusted the book," she said. "He trusted you would rebind it well enough that no one would think to look." It was not praise, not quite, but she felt it land as such, low and unshowy, the way true respect often did in this house. Never declared, only implied through the weight a man gave his words when he was too tired to choose them carefully. She looked at the ruined N-band beside the thread, at the small violence her own hands had done to her own careful work, and felt, beneath the exhaustion, something she had not expected, a fierce, unpolished pride, the kind that asked for no audience. The Marquis set the folded will down again, unopened still, and rose from the table. "Fetch the solicitor," he said to the butler waiting at the door. "Now, whatever the hour." The clock struck the half. The butler did not move at once. He looked instead at the will lying closed upon the table, and then at her hands, and something in his long face tightened, though he said nothing that any clock might mark. 11 hours, she thought, perhaps less now, with the half already struck, and the solicitor's house a mile off in the wet dark. She had learned, these last 2 days, to measure the world in such fractions: a quarter hour for the thread to be drawn clean, 10 minutes lost to a knot that would not yield, an hour's grace wasted on tea gone cold, before either of them remembered to drink it. "Now," the Marquis said again, and this time the butler went, his candle bobbing away down the corridor like a small resolute star. She did not open the will. It was not hers to open, and some instinct older than curiosity told her that whatever lay folded inside the oiled paper belonged, for the moment, to the silence between the two of them, and no one else, not yet to the solicitor, not yet to the court, not yet even fully to the Marquis himself, who stood looking at it, as a man might look at a door he had spent 11 months believing did not exist. "You should sit," she said, because his hands, she noticed, had begun the same small tremor hers had shown an hour before. "I have sat enough this year." But he did sit, all the same, in the chair opposite, as though her saying it had given him leave. He had not permitted himself alone. The candle between them had burned low, its wax pooling unevenly at the base, and by its thinning light she gathered the ruined threads from the table, the N-band unpicked, the false stitching she herself had sewn a year before, now nothing but a small heap of colored silk, useless, its work undone. She found she could not throw it away. She folded it instead into her handkerchief, without quite knowing why, and put it in her pocket, the way one keeps the wrapping of a gift, long after the gift itself has been given. 11 hours, the Marquis said, not to her precisely, but to the will, to the room, to the ticking silence that had followed the half-hour's chime. And a solicitor who will want to examine every seam of it before he calls it valid. He will find no forgery in the seams, she said. Only in what it says. She had not meant to say so much, and saw, in the flicker of his eyes toward her, that he had heard the words as more than she intended, a warning perhaps, though of what she could not yet have named, not with the paper still folded, not with the hour still counting down beneath them both like a held breath. The clock in the passage beyond the library struck the quarter, a thin brass sound swallowed almost at once by the heavy air of the room. He did not look toward it. He had the look of a man counting, without wanting to be seen counting, his gaze fixed instead on the folded paper she had not yet handed him, as though by watching it he might keep it from becoming anything other than what it already was. "You should eat something," he said abruptly. "You have not, I think, since noon. Nor have you. That is not the same thing." She did not argue the point, though she thought it very much was. Her hands, when she pressed them flat against the table to steady them, showed the marks of 2 days' work, a burn along one knuckle where the candle had guttered too close, the skin at her fingertips gone soft and raw from handling old thread. She had not noticed these things happening. She noticed them now, in the stillness after the unpicking was done, the way one notices a bruise only once the danger that caused it has passed. The butler entered without being summoned. Carrying a tray he set down with the particular quiet of a man who has learned, over 40 years, exactly how much noise a household in crisis can bear. He said nothing of the hour, though his glance moved once to the clock, and once, longer, to her hands. "The solicitor will want the document brought to him directly," the Marquis said, when the butler had gone. "Not read here, not discussed here. He is a careful man, and carefulness, at this hour, is not something I intend to resent. You resented it 3 days ago." 3 days ago, I had less reason to be grateful for it." She looked up at that, and he did not look away, and for a moment the room held something that was not quite the ticking counted-down silence of before, something slower, more deliberate, though neither of them named it. Then he seemed to catch himself, as a man catches his own reflection unexpectedly in a window, and turned back to the paper. 11 hours, he said again, quieter this time, is not so very long. It is longer than the 2 days you gave me to unmake a year's work. I gave you nothing, you chose it. I did, she said. I would choose it again. He studied her a moment, as though weighing what it had cost her against what she claimed it had not, and found, perhaps, that the two did not match, that her steadiness, which he had taken all this while as simple composure, might instead have been something paid for, coin by coin, out of a reserve he had never thought to ask whether she possessed. He said nothing of this. He only reached for the paper, at last, and did not yet unfold it. The candle had burned to a stub of its former height, and no one had thought to replace it. The butler stood near the door with a fresh taper in his hand, waiting for a pause in which to act without seeming to intrude upon what passed between them, though what passed between them was, in truth, only silence, and a folded paper neither of them had yet opened. 11 hours. The clock in the hall had already begun its slow accounting of the 10th. She watched his thumb move along the edge of the oiled paper, testing its give, the way she herself had tested the thickness of a spine a year before, and called it old glue. He did not open it. He held it as a man holds a letter he has waited a long time to receive, and now finds himself unwilling to read too quickly, for fear the reading will end something he has not yet finished feeling. "You ought to unfold it," she said, "before the hour grows shorter still. I am aware of the hour." "Then you are aware it does not wait upon sentiment." He looked at her then, and something in his face suggested he had heard this before, from his father perhaps, in a different room, over a different paper, and did not care for the resemblance. He unfolded it. The paper made a small sound, dry and reluctant, like a door that has not been opened in years. Inside, the ink had browned with time, but held its shape, the late Marquis's hand steady even at the end, each letter formed with the care of a man who knew it would be the last thing of his he was ever asked to prove. He read. She did not watch his face while he did so, thinking it unkind to witness a grief so recently reopened, and instead watched the butler, who had at last approached to set the fresh candle beside the old, his movements unhurried, his eyes flicking once toward her hands, still resting flat upon the table, as though to still their trembling by main force. "It is his hand," the Marquess said finally, "not a question, a fact laid down like a stone." "I did not doubt it would be." "No," he agreed. "You seldom doubt anything you have already proven to yourself in private." She said nothing to that, for it was true, and she had learned there was little use in denying a true thing spoken kindly. He read further, and his face, which had held itself so carefully through the candle-lit hours, changed by degrees too small to name, the way frost changes on a window before anyone marks the exact moment it became ice. He turned the paper over, read again, his jaw tightened. "There is more here," he said, "than a will." She looked up at that, and something in his voice, not fear exactly, but its near cousin, told her the hour had shifted its shape entirely, and that whatever he had just found was not the sort of thing a clock could measure. He did not say what he had found. He folded the paper along its old crease, the sound small and dry as a leaf breaking, and for a long moment he only stared at the clock upon the mantel, as though its face might tell him something the document had not. 11 hours. The hand had moved since she last looked, though she could not say when. "Read it," she said, "or do not, but do not sit with it like a stone in your shoe." He almost smiled. It did not reach the rest of his face. "You have a talent for saying the thing no one else in this house would dare." "I have less to lose by saying it." He looked at her then, really looked, the way he had not since she'd first drawn the oiled paper from the ruined spine and set it upon the table between them, like something newly born and still wet from the birth of it. "You have more to lose than you say," he answered quietly, and turned back to the page before she could answer that. The candle guttered, She reached without thinking, and trimmed the wick with the small shears from her work-basket, an old habit, her father's habit, done 1,000 times without the mind's permission. The light steadied. He read on. When he spoke again, his voice had gone careful in a new way, not the careful of grief, but the careful of a man walking on ice he suspects will not hold. My mother's hand is here as well. She went very still. Outside, some late cart rattled over the gravel drive, wheels loud in the emptied hour, and then was gone, and the silence after it seemed thicker for having been broken. Your mother's, she repeated, to be certain she had heard him. Not upon the will itself. He set the paper down, smoothed it flat with 2 fingers, as though smoothing might undo what was written there. A codicil, smaller, folded within the folding, the way you might hide a smaller trouble inside a larger one, and hope no one has patience enough to find both. She thought of the end band she had unpicked not 2 hours past, thread by thread, each one a small betrayal of her own careful hands, and understood, with a kind of cold clarity, that there had been more hidden in that spine than one dying man's distrust. There had been 2. What does it say? He did not answer at once. He looked instead at the clock, then at her, then at the fire, which had burned low and needed tending, and would not receive it. Not yet. Not while the hour held them both fixed to their chairs, like figures pinned to a page. It says, he said finally, that I must decide, before the sun rises, what kind of son I mean to be. She did not ask him to explain further. She only reached again for the candle, and trimmed it, and waited, as the clock above them measured out what remained of the night, in small, indifferent increments, uninterested in what either of them chose to do with it. He did not tend the fire. He sat instead with the smaller paper unfolded across his knee, and she watched the firelight move over his face without settling anywhere. The way water moves over stone it cannot wear down quickly enough to matter. The clock struck the half-hour. Neither of them turned to look at it, though both of them heard it, and both of them counted, in the private arithmetic of the sleepless, how many such chimes remained before the county court's patience expired, along with its deadline. 11 hours, she thought, perhaps 11 and a quarter, if the roads held. Your mother's hand, he said at last, was never meant for forgery. She has beautiful penmanship, wasted, in this instance, on a lie small enough to fit inside a larger truth. He said it without bitterness, which frightened her more than bitterness would have. A man in a rage could be reasoned with, or waited out. A man speaking calmly of his own mother's crime, at 3 in the morning, with a document that could ruin her sitting open on his knee. That man was past the reach of comfort, and she did not know how to offer any that would not sound like presumption. She believed you disinherited, Nell said. It was not a question. She had read enough of the paper, in the moments he'd allowed her to see it, to understand the shape of the fear that had driven the dowager's hand across that smaller page years before. A mother convinced her son had been struck from his own father's will, acting in the only language available to a woman with no legal standing of her own. Ink and nerve, and a hope that no one would look closely enough at what she had added to protect him. She believed wrongly, he said. As it happens, the true will names me still. Her forgery corrected an injury that never occurred. He folded the smaller paper along its old crease, the paper sighing as it went, tired of being opened and closed by trembling hands. Which leaves me the owner of an estate I was always meant to inherit, and the son of a woman who broke the law to save me from a fate I was never in danger of. The fire cracked. Somewhere above them a floorboard settled, the house exhaling in its sleep. Nell said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say that would not tip the scale one way or the other, and it was not her scale to tip. She had unpicked stitches, not judgments. She had drawn a paper from a spine. She had not been asked to draw a verdict from a man's conscience. He rose, finally, and set both papers, the great one and the small one, side by side upon the table, as though laying out 2 patients for the same surgeon. 11 hours, he said, echoing her own count, without knowing he did so. And one decision that has waited 9 months already for someone brave enough to make it. The clock on the mantel gave its small brass cough, the sound it made each quarter hour, as if clearing its throat before an opinion it had no right to offer. Nell counted the chimes without meaning to. 2, 3. She had learned, over 2 days without proper sleep, to let numbers walk through her mind unbidden, the way other women counted stitches or sheep. He did not look at the clock. He looked at the papers. "You could burn the small one," she said, and was surprised to hear her own voice, rough with disuse. "No one has seen it, but the two of us, and the butler, who will say what you tell him to say." He would say nothing regardless. "That is not the offer you are making." "No," she admitted. "The offer is that no one need ever know your mother did what she did. The house keeps its secrets well. It has kept worse." He turned then, and for the first time since she had drawn the paper from the spine, he looked at her instead of at the will, not the practiced, courteous look he gave to solicitors and cousins and dowagers who required managing. Something plainer. "You unpicked your own work to find that paper," he said. "Every stitch you had put in with your own hands, not knowing what you were undoing until it was undone. Was there a moment you considered leaving it be, sealing the spine again, and saying nothing had been found?" The question landed harder than she expected. She thought of the second night, past midnight, when her fingers had cramped around the bone folder, and some small traitorous part of her had thought, no one need ever know a document existed at all. She had not spoken the thought aloud then. She would not speak it now. "There was a moment," she said. "It passed." "Why?" "Because a Bible is not meant to hold a lie in its spine, not even a kind one." She heard how strange it sounded, said plainly, and did not soften it. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite a smile, not quite its opposite. He gathered the papers at last, the great will and the small confession, and placed them together inside his coat, over his heart, where a lesser man might have put a locket. 11 hours, he said again, and I have not yet decided whether the county court will see one document or two. That is not mine to decide. No, he agreed, but you will sit with me while I do it. I find I cannot think clearly in an empty room tonight, and every room in this house feels emptier than it did a year ago. Fire had burned low, throwing more shadow than light now across the table where the papers had lain. Somewhere beyond the windows, the church clock in the village began, faintly, its own separate reckoning of the hour, a sound she would carry, she suspected, long after this night had folded itself into memory, like the paper he had just folded twice and put away. She sat, because there was nothing else to do with a body that had stopped being useful the moment the needle left her hand. Her fingers, she noticed, had not yet stopped their small, involuntary tremor, the muscle memory of 2 days' work insisting it was not finished, though the work was finished, though the thing it had guarded now lay folded against another man's heart instead of hidden in hers. The butler brought tea neither of them had asked for, and set it down without comment, though his eyes went once to her hands, and stayed there a moment longer than courtesy required, before he withdrew. 10 hours, the Marquis said, not looking at the clock, looking instead at the fire, which had contracted to a low red seam among the ash. I keep counting it, as though the number itself will tell me what to do with it. It will not. No, he almost smiled. You are remarkably unhelpful for a woman who has just solved everything. I have solved the binding. I have not solved the mother. She said it quietly, without accusation, and watched him absorb the plainness of it, the way a man absorbs cold water, all at once, with a small, involuntary stiffening. He did not answer directly. Instead, he rose, crossed to the window, and stood with his back to her, a habit she had come to recognize as the shape his thinking took when it could not yet bear to be watched. Beyond the glass, the churchyard clock had gone silent again after its single stroke, leaving only the drip of rain along the gutter, patient, unhurried, indifferent to deadlines, and courts, and the particular arithmetic of shame. She did it for me, he said at last. Badly. Foolishly, but for me. I know. You knew before I told you the whole of it. I guessed the shape of it, the rest was only confirmation. She wrapped her hands around the teacup, less for warmth than to still them, and did not entirely succeed. He turned then, and studied her the way he had once studied a damaged spine of vellum, assessing not what remained whole, but what the strain had cost the material to survive. "You are still shaking," he said, and it was not quite a question. "It will pass." "It has not passed in an hour." "Then perhaps," she said, meeting his eyes with the last of whatever composure the night had left her, "it costs more than either of us has allowed for." He did not reply at once. The fire settled further, and the rain went on outside, counting its own hours, indifferent to the 10 that remained, and to the 2 people who sat within them saying, at last, something true. 10 hours. The clock on the mantel had a particular fault. It ran 4 minutes slow, had run 4 minutes slow for as long as anyone in the household could remember, and no one had troubled to correct it, as though the family had decided long ago that time in this room could be allowed its small inaccuracies. She watched it now the way she had watched it an hour before, and an hour before that, with the fixed attention of someone counting not minutes but the diminishing distance between herself and a task not yet finished. The will lay where he had set it, on the low table between them, still creased from its long folding, the ink gone the particular brown that ink goes after decades of no light. Beside it, the oiled paper that had kept it whole, and beside that, curling now that it was no longer needed, the thread she had drawn from the false end band, her own stitching, cut loose, its purpose exhausted. The butler entered without knocking, as he had done twice already that night, and set down a fresh pot of tea neither of them had asked for. He looked at her hands before he looked at either face, the way he had been looking at her hands for 2 days, and something in his expression suggested he had already drawn his own conclusions and saw no reason to trouble anyone with them. "The solicitor will want the document by first light," he said. "He is anxious it be presented in proper form. He has asked twice whether the binding might be repaired before it is shown to the court." "It will not be repaired," she said. "Not before the court sees it. Let them see exactly what was done and undone to bring it to them." The Marquis looked at her a moment longer than the remark required. "You would rather it look torn." "I would rather it look true," she said. "There is a difference, and men who sit in judgment ought to be made to see it." The butler's mouth moved, not quite a smile, and he withdrew as quietly as he had come, leaving the tea to steam unattended between them. Outside, the rain had thinned to something less than rain, a mist that clung to the glass rather than struck it, softening the dark beyond the window into a single unbroken gray. 10 hours remained, and within them, still, the smaller labor, the will must be carried, presented, defended, before men who had never touched its paper, nor understood what unpicking it had cost. She thought of the cousin, and the solicitor's careful doubts, and wondered which of them would look first at the document, and which would look first at her hands. "You should sleep," he said. "An hour. Even that." "There is no hour to spare for sleeping." "Then there is no hour to spare for pretending you do not need it either," he said, and did not move to make her go. She did not answer him at once. The needle was through the last stitch of the false end band now, the thread drawn taut and thin between her fingers, and she held it there, as though the pause itself were a kind of rest, though it was not, though nothing in the room had slowed at all. 9 hours and some minutes. She had begun counting differently in the last day, not the hours remaining whole, but the small increments inside them, the space it took to draw one stitch clear, the space it took to breathe once through the nose and let the hand steady before the next. "I have slept less on smaller matters," she said finally, and did not look up. "A torn signature, a client's temper, this is only larger." "It is not only larger," he said, "it is mine." She glanced at him then, briefly, the way one glances at a ledger column to confirm a sum already known. His face in the candlelight had none of the coldness she remembered from a year before, when he had stood in the ruined library and spoken to her as though she were an inconvenience the flood had also produced. There was instead a kind of held stillness, a man keeping his own hands from reaching for what they could not help. "Then let me finish it," she said, "so that it may stop being only yours, and become simply true." He said nothing to that. The rain, or what remained of it, pressed its gray breath to the window, and somewhere below a clock, she could not see, struck the half-hour with a flatness that seemed to fall through the floor rather than ring in it. She counted the strokes without meaning to. 9.5 hours now, precisely, and the last threads of the end band still holding what she needed to reach. She bent again to the work. The candle guttered once and steadied. Her fingers, which had not trembled through the worst of the unpicking, trembled now at the edges, not from fear of failure, she thought, but from the nearness of success, which asked of the hands a different, crueler steadiness than despair ever had. Nearly, she murmured, not to him, not to the butler standing unseen beyond the door, but to the Bible itself, as though it might be coaxed the last small distance by courtesy alone. The Marquis did not move to the door as she had expected. He remained where he was, watching the candlelight catch the thread, watching her hands work at the very stitches her own hands had set a year ago, in good faith and ignorance both. 9 hours, perhaps less now. The paper beneath the false binding shifted faintly under her fingers, as if it, too, had been waiting for the mist outside to thin before it dared to be found. The last stitch gave with a sound so small she nearly did not credit it as sound at all, a whisper of thread parting, no louder than a moth against glass. She held her breath as though breath itself might disturb the paper now visible in the gap her needle had made, a pale edge, oiled and faintly yellowed, tucked where no binder's eye but hers had ever thought to look twice. She did not reach for it at once. There was a discipline in that hesitation the Marquis did not immediately understand, though he watched her hands go still above the very thing they had labored 2 days to uncover. She was not savoring the moment. She was steadying herself for it, the way she had once told him, nearly a year past, in a library still smelling of standing water, that the last cut of any restoration was the one a careless hand ruined, because pride arrived exactly when caution should have doubled. 8 hours and some minutes, the butler said quietly from the doorway, though no one had asked him the hour. He had taken to announcing it unprompted these last 2 days, as though the counting itself were a service he could render, when there was so little else to be done with his hands. She drew the paper free at last, both hands beneath it, cradling rather than pulling, and the oiled wrapping came away from the spine with a faint resistance and then none, and it lay across her palms, folded thrice, sealed once with wax gone brittle and dark, the late Marquis's own hand upon the direction, small and firm, unmistakably his even in its last failing steadiness. No one spoke. The candle burned without complaint for the first time in an hour, as though the room itself had exhaled. She did not offer it to him at once either. She turned it once in the light, checking, from habit, from the same care that had made her unpick her own good work stitch by stitch rather than risk a blade near it, that the seal was whole, that damp had not reached what damp had once ruined an entire library trying to reach. Only when she was satisfied did she hold it out across the small space between the work table and where he stood, and her hand, extending it, shook badly enough that the paper trembled with it, a fine tremor she made no effort to hide, because there was, at that moment, nothing left in her to spend on hiding it. "There," she said, nothing more, as though the word itself were the last stitch, and all that remained now was for him to take what she had spent 2 days, and a year before that, learning how to give back whole. He did not take it at once. For a moment, he only looked at the paper trembling in her outstretched hand, as though taking it required a different kind of courage than any he had yet been asked for in this house. Then he crossed the last of the distance and took it from her, carefully, his fingers closing around the oiled paper rather than her hand, though the two were close enough that she felt the warmth of him before the coolness of his taking it away. The clock on the mantel gave 11 strokes before he broke the seal. 11 hours. She counted them without meaning to, the way she had counted stitches for 2 days, the way the mind counts what it has been trained too long to count. He unfolded the will with a slowness that was its own kind of violence to her nerves, worn thin already by candlelight and thread. The solicitor leaned forward. The butler, by the door, did not move at all, though his eyes had not left her face since she'd drawn the paper from the spine. The Marquis read. She watched the reading rather than the words, watched the small motions of a man's face when it is deciding what to believe. His jaw did not tighten so much as still, the way water stills before a frost takes it. His eyes moved once, twice, across a passage near the bottom of the second page, and something in him seemed to recede a little, as though he had stepped back from himself to make room for what he was learning. "It is his hand," he said at last. Not a question. He said it the way a man confirms a diagnosis he had already suspected and hoped, without real hope, to be spared. The solicitor exhaled, the sound of a man setting down a weight he had carried further than his years wished to carry it. "Then the matter is settled," he said, though his voice did not yet sound settled at all. "The court need only see the true instrument to—" "The court will see it," the Marquis said, and something in his tone closed the sentence before the solicitor could finish shaping his relief into words. He was still reading. His eyes had reached the second page again, the part near the bottom that had stilled his jaw the first time, and this time they did not move on so quickly. She did not know, then, what was written there. She knew only that whatever it was, it had cost him something to read, that the will's mere existence had not cost him, that recovering the document had answered one question and opened, quietly, without ceremony, another. The candle burned low between them. Outside, past the shuttered glass, she could not tell whether it was still night or already the gray edge of the last morning left to them. The solicitor did not press him. Whatever caution had kept the old man employed through 2 marquises taught him, still, when a silence wanted keeping. He gathered his ledgers instead, the movement of a man giving himself something to do with his hands, and did not ask what troubled the second page. She watched the Marquis fold the will along its old creases, slowly, as though the paper itself might object to being closed again, after so long shut away. His fingers lingered at the fold nearest the bottom, not the fold of a man finished reading, the fold of a man deciding what to do with what he had read. "The clerk will want it by 9, the solicitor said. Sworn, witnessed, presented whole. 70. He stopped himself, glanced at the case clock in the corner, as though it might correct him kindly, and did not finish the number. 11 hours, she thought, perhaps less by the time the horses were saddled. The Marquis did not answer him directly. He set the will on the desk, face down, and for a moment his hand remained flat upon it, the way a man might rest his hand on a coffin lid before the nails go in. Not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that knew grief's shape from long practice. "You'll want rest before the ride," he said, though whether he meant the solicitor or her, she could not at first tell. Then his eyes found hers, and she understood. She had not noticed, until he said it, how badly her hands had begun to shake. Not from cold, the candle threw enough warmth for that not to be the excuse she might have offered an hour before. It was the strain of the needle held too long, against too fine a strain, the small muscles of the wrist paying now for 2 days of borrowed steadiness. "I am well enough," she said, which was not quite a lie, and not quite the truth either. The answer of a woman who had spent a lifetime learning that composure, once offered, was rarely permitted to be withdrawn. The butler, standing near the door with the patience of a man who had outlasted 3 decades of family crises larger than this one, said nothing. But she caught the flicker of his glance toward her hands before it moved, discreetly, to the Marquis's face, a glance that seemed to ask whether his master had truly seen what stood before him, or only the document that stood between them. The Marquis did not look away from her this time. Whatever had unsettled him in the second page of his father's will remained folded now, private, unspoken, but something else had shifted into its place, something that watched her the way one watches a bridge, after learning, too late, what weight it had carried to bear him safely across. "Sit," he said, "before you cannot." She did not sit at once. Pride, even now, required a moment's delay, as though obedience, too quickly given, might be mistaken for collapse. But the room tilted very slightly at the edges, candlelight smearing along the spines of the shelved books, and she lowered herself into the chair the butler had already, without being asked, drawn closer to the table. 11 hours remained before the court's clerk would open his ledger and mark the estate's fate one way or the other. She knew this because she had been counting, the way she had counted every hour since the petition was filed. Not aloud, never aloud, but in the small arithmetic that ran beneath every stitch she had drawn and every stitch she had, at the last, undone. The Marquis set down the true will beside the false end-band she had unpicked from it, the two lying together now like a confession and its cover. He did not speak of the second page again, though she understood, without being told, what silence would be kept, and for whom. That was his to carry. She had only been asked to open the door. What stood behind it was his to close, gently, on his mother's behalf. "You will send the account for the workshop," he said instead, in the same clipped voice he had used to command her 3 days before, to work faster, though it carried now a different weight, as though the same words had been asked to serve a new purpose. "The lease and the tools. Whatever my father's debts took from your family, they will be returned, not as payment." A pause, brief, deliberate, as correction. She had not asked for this. She understood, even as he said it, that this was precisely why he offered it. Her hand, resting on the table's edge, had not stopped its faint trembling, the aftershock of 2 days' work compressed into muscles too fine to hide their cost. He looked at it the way he had looked, an hour before, at the document that would decide his household's future, carefully, and for longer than courtesy required. Then he covered it with his own. He said nothing further. There was no need. The butler, near the door, allowed himself the smallest exhale, the sound of a man who had waited 3 decades to see his master notice what stood before him, and not merely what stood between them. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist against the library windows, and somewhere below, a clock she could not see continued its patient counting, though for the first time in 2 days, she was no longer listening to it. Her hand did not stop trembling. His